Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Steve Schale, a 28-year veteran of American politics. In 2008, Steve directed the Obama-Biden campaign in Florida, returning in 2012 as a senior advisor. In 2014, he led Gwen Graham's congressional effort and was an advisor to her 2018 governor's race. Most recently, Steve serves as CEO of Unite the Country, a pro-Joe Biden super PAC which formed in October of 2019 and raised nearly $100 million. He also helped out the candidacy of Vice President Kamala Harris. In addition, Steve spent 25 years working in and around the Florida legislature. God bless you, Steve, for that. He was communications director for the House Democratic Caucus and served as a longtime aide to former House Democratic leader Doug Wiles. From 2005 to 2008, he ran the Florida Democratic Party's House Democratic Caucus, during which Florida Democrats picked off a record 9 Republican seats in the state house. Today, he provides strategic advice to a number of clients, including Walt Disney, AT&T, Marriott, and Waymo. Outside of politics, Steve serves on the board of the Epilepsy Alliance of Florida, Awesome Tallahassee, the American Council of Young Political Leaders, with whom he has traveled in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa on political exchange and mentoring programs, and is a founding member of Drive for the Future, an organization to support high school golf programs in disadvantaged communities. He's also a member of Leadership for Florida, Cornerstone Class 31. He and his wife, Nicole, live in Tallahassee with their 2 dogs and a horse named Zeus. Tell me about Zeus, Steve.
My wife rode when she was younger, and, maybe 10, 15 years ago, she's like, yeah, I want to get a horse. I'm like, what the hell are we going to do with a horse? Like, we live in a suburban neighborhood, and I did not think she was serious. And I came home one day and she's like, I want you to meet my new friend, Zeke, which was our previous horse. And I'm like, oh, I'd love to know who Zeke is. And Zeke was an off the track thoroughbred. So it's her mental health therapy. I go out and feed it carrots and occasionally fix stuff at the barn. But for her, it's a good break from me, I think.
So you live in a townhouse then?
Yeah, pretty much a little suburban neighborhood. But yeah, with the 2 dogs are fine, but the horse I think would probably raise the ire of the HOA.
Right. Well, listen, thanks so much for making time. You and I have been sort of in communication for a couple of years, really, maybe mid, Lincoln Project days. And obviously, I think you probably know Rick from a while because you guys are both Tallahassee guys. But give us a sense, you ran Unite the Country in 2020 for President Biden. You were involved last year in 2024. Give us a sense of, what you think changed in those 4 years and what you think needs to happen. And when I say this, out in the super PAC aspect of Democratic politics, I have a lot of opinions, but you've actually run one. So give us a sense of what you think changed fundamentally in those 4 years and where we are now.
First of all, your old colleague, Rick, I always like to point out, I was friends with Rick when my Democratic friends hate that I knew Rick. And now I've been friends long enough that my Republican friends raise their eyebrows.
Right,
So
exactly.
Rick's a longtime friend, just a good member of the Florida Hack Caucus, as we call it. Yeah, so Reed, I got into running a super PAC completely on accident, which is pretty much how most things in my life happened. I'd been involved with then Vice President Biden's effort to potentially run for president. Kind of thought my presidential days were over when he didn't run. We wake up and kind of the worst case scenario happens and Hillary doesn't win. And and all of a sudden it's kind of like, well, maybe we might do this again. And I had actually planned on joining the hard side of the campaign, the official side of the campaign, and they realized, I think, over the summer in 2019 that they were taking on water from both the left and the right. I mean, that you had, it was just, they couldn't compete without having an outside group helping. And so there's a great lesson in life, Read, about not answering the telephone when you're at a friend's 40th birthday party on a Friday night, maybe 8 or 9 beers into the night. And I walked outside of my friend's brewery, and I walked back in and told my wife, oh, we got a new endeavor. And and so we started out as an entity that existed, again, to support then former Vice President Biden run for president, raised $100 million. We did a bunch of stuff, kind of in the interim, tried to help support the agenda a little bit. And then in 2024, we were largely an organization that was working with labor unions who just needed a vehicle to deliver some messaging. And obviously, we pivoted to Vice President Harris when she ran. It's interesting. I went into, first of all, I had no idea what a absolute minefield super PAC world was when I got into it. It's there's definitely a very strong sort of DC world around that. I'm a guy that's lived in Florida my whole life. I try to stay out of DC as much as I humanly can. And what was interesting in 2020, because there was so if you go back to say 2012, the first sort of super PAC year, Priorities USA formed to support then President Obama's reelection, Priorities sort of existed in 2016. There was always kind of a single group that did the work. In 2020, as we all kind of participated, you had this unique ecosystem where you had a lot of groups that were doing a lot of different things. And it was because we took us a while to figure out who our nominee was going to be. That ecosystem, I think, former Vice President Biden in his race. You had, groups like y'all doing really interesting and creative work. I think we were doing interesting work with kind of, focused on a lot of these sort of, non-college white voters that we'd lost. You had interesting folks, this woman named Adrienne Shropshire, I talk about. I'd never met her until I got into this stuff. And who at Black PAC was doing really, really cool work with Black men in urban communities. It made a huge difference. And then in 2024, we kind of went back to that model before where there was just one group making all the calls. And, there were a lot of really smart people at Future Forward. I don't want to be unkind to them, but I think the thing about 2020 was you had your eggs in a lot of baskets, and you had a world where, the talent sort of rose to the top. The good ideas got funded, and you had sort of the free market of things. And in 24, listen, if the theory of the case was wrong, then we were all effed. And,
right.
And so, my hope, I honestly, I thought I figured I was hoping, listen, I wanted Kamala Harris to win. If Kamala Harris would win, I would not be sitting here with Unite the Country title on. I would have happily gone back to what I was doing. But I sort of feel more now than ever that we need diverse voices, and diverse, not just in ethnicity and gender, but also ideological and non-DC versus DC, voices in this conversation. That's what we're trying to do now is to add a different perspective to this question about where the party goes forward.
Well, so I want to get to that, but I want to start with the super PAC thing, and then I want to go back a second. So yeah, that was the one thing, and I said this to somebody else I interviewed recently, which was when last summer when Trump was when he'd been convicted, right? And they were clearly worried. You could tell if you spend enough time studying, Trump world, you knew that they thought this was a bad deal. And I'm like, get in there. Somebody keep him pinned down. Nothing happened. Then the president decides he's not. Well, the presidential debate happens. President Biden doesn't perform. And then there's this interregnum, right? Where will he, won't he? And there's this pressure from all over the place. But in the meantime, no one is filling the vacuum.
No communication.
Right. It's just like, well, until and unless the White House can make a decision, nothing's going to happen. And so I'm, from my little perch, I'm kicking and screaming. I'm like, what about these Future Forward people? Well, they don't believe in early money. Like, why do they get to decide? Like, strategically, right? The presidential campaign, whether or not it's Joe Biden or somebody else, right, is taking hits. It's taking on water. Why are they just sitting there not doing anything? Well, they don't believe anybody's paying attention. I'm like, what century do they think we're in? And then there's the other part too, Steve, which is like, and who deputized these assholes to make a decision like that? Right. And is there ever anybody who can say, no? Like, I know we've asked you to run this thing, but here's the deal. Like, you answer to us too, right? We've put $700 million into you. Like, and once in a while, like, we think we know what you should do. And you're like, you're going to go do it. Like, why is it that former Republicans used to talk about unelected bureaucrats? Like, why are unelected consultants allowed to wield so much power?
Listen, man, I was with you. I mean, I think we may have talked about it then. It was driving me nuts. I mean, I talked to some folks around there, as much as I could, as some consultants, take even before the debate. I mean, we did some polling. I'm sure you've seen some too. You go back to January, February. I mean, Biden was incredibly upside down on issues like immigration, crime, right. Economy, you name it. Like, it wasn't just any one thing. And that's part of my frustration about coming out of the election. People keep thinking it's about one thing. It was never about just one thing. It was about a lot of things. And my theory was always, as a super PAC, and this was our case, and this is how we operated in 2020, which is every dollar I have in the bank right now is wasting in the bank. I mean, for a lot of reasons. First of all, if your point, if there's nobody communicating, then there's just a vacuum. And if you go back to, say, 2012 or even 2020, there were a lot of groups that, Priorities USA, all of their communication in 2012 happened in this window between, the end of the Republican primary and sort of the start of the general. They didn't really do much after that because that was the window. Not only did it make most sense to give the campaign time to recharge, it's also cheaper for an outside group.
Right.
I mean, that's the other thing I've stressed to folks. It's like, it is so expensive for a super PAC to operate on traditional television in September and October because you're competing with Morgan and Morgan and Carfer. Like, you're buying at the highest possible rate. So not only are you like missing the window to drive voters, you're also like, it's hugely inefficient. I mean, there was, and so yeah, I don't know. It was maddening, and again, we, with the little money we had, we tried to go up when we could. I mean, we didn't have enough firepower to make a big enough difference. But, I mean, for example, in 2020, I mean, we just, as soon as we had like $15 million coming out of the primary, we knew that Joe Biden was not well defined among general election voters. So we just went up on TV and spent our money. And it was, and that was how we viewed it.
Well, and, going back to 2020, that's what, our role was different, but complementary, which was in the same vein, which was we knew that, when we went to speak at the Cooper Union in New York City in late February, we thought Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee. And we said, if that's who it's going to be, that's who we'll support. 3 weeks later, COVID shuts everything down and everything changes. President Biden is now the nominee. And so we saw our role as pinning Trump down until the campaign and the Democratic battleship could come online, which was likely going to be right around that time of the convention. Because, as you said, no one had expected him to be the nominee. So there wasn't any there. But again, those were complementary efforts, all of which were helpful in their own ways, which was we made him crazy. We made him look crazier. We kept him pinned down. We walked him into box canyons. We made him look inefficient, ineffectual, incompetent. Right. And then, when other people came online, it all added up to victory, and a very narrow victory at that.
Yeah.
And so that is, one thing. And then just one other quick story. So going back to 2006 for Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Like in the primary, the Democrats have Steve Wesley and Phil Angelides, right? Wesley's a billionaire. Angelides he was treasurer or something at the time, right? Like, we didn't know who we were going to get, but we had a plan, which was we were going to give the Democratic nominee 2 days off, right? It was a June primary. And on the third day, we dropped $11 million on their head, right? Because we wanted to drive their numbers so far down that in the summer, right, when quote unquote, no one's paying attention, that aside from the fact we had the most popular person on the planet, right, which obviously helped, and we had the ability to raise money, there was no possible way they could dig out of that hole electorally. There was just no way they were going to be able to, even if they had outraised us, which they couldn't, they were never going to do that. And that seemed to me to be like, instead of saying, well, we have to play by these rules, which is quote unquote, no one pays attention till Labor Day. Clearly we see that's not the case anymore, that the conservatives, the MAGAs, whoever, they're communicating 24/65. And Trump has consistently been outspent in his campaigns, and he won 2 out of 3. And so to me, that's where, as we look at the strategy and the tactics of politics, Steve, not even the ideology, right? Let's just set that aside for a second. It seems to me that there's a rut that too many of your friends and people who I sort of know but don't really know are like, this is how we do it, and we're not going to do it differently because we've decided this is how it's going to go, but it continues to not work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and again, I think that there's also, if you go back to 2020, you had a lot of different competing theories that were helping each other too. I mean, so not only the idea was money being spent earlier, but like, so, we were created as an organization to help Joe Biden. I had no preconceived notion of how we would win a general election until we got out of the primary. Like, I didn't have time to think about it. I had to think about how do I get my guy out of a primary where, our candidate who we were supporting had almost no money. So we were kind of them for the most part from a paid side. And so we came out of the primary. Most people were sort of focused on this anti-Trump lane, which was the right thing to do. What we found in our research was there was part of that conversation was people didn't know Joe Biden. They knew him as sort of this goofy former vice president, but they didn't know any of his life story. They didn't know what he wanted to do. And so, had we just had the one entity in 2020, I suspect that we never would have defined Joe Biden, and we probably wouldn't have won that race. And so, I think that also just having more organizations, more smart people at the table. I mean, listen, it's like anything in life. The more smart people you can have working on things, the better outcome you're going to have. And like, there are plenty of smart people that worked on Future Forward. I mean, but they had a single theory. And if that theory worked, great, we won. But if it didn't work, we were all fucked. And that's kind of what happened here. And again, I know Pluff's talked about this. He talked about that in that Pod Save interview they did afterwards, because he was part of that 2020 ecosystem, as you can remember, the stuff they did through acronym.
Right.
And, I think, again, I hope going forward, if there's one lesson, and part of this, man, as you know, and I don't probably get myself in huge trouble here, a part of this is like the campaign White House wanted one entity that made sense. The other thing is like the donors wanted one thing. They don't want to have to deal with 25 requests. And so these donor advisors who really control a lot of that's a part of our ecosystem we don't really talk enough about. But
it's because they're AA ball players.
Yeah.
Right. Like they're the guys who couldn't hit a major league fastball, but they convinced somebody that somehow actually what I believe, and I don't care if this is unkind, is like I think they're people who give donors the cover to say no. That's really what I think their main job is.
But they also don't want to deal with having to make advice. It's easier for them to say, hey, this is the thing to give money to, than it is to say, hey, there's 4 or 5 things here that are pretty interesting. We got to figure out, or maybe we help them all, or maybe we make them talk to each other. And so,
but isn't that supposed to be their job?
Sure.
Like if you're advising not to find the path of least resistance, but the path to victory.
Yeah. And a lot of them they have their own relationships and their own friends, and they like going to cool parties too. And so it's just, it's frustrating. And I mean, like this cycle, I mean, I'm sure, as the Lincoln, as everybody found this cycle, if you weren't priorities, it was hard to get phone calls. I mean, not priorities, but future forward. If you weren't them, it was very hard to get your calls returned.
Right. No, and I think that again, let me step into another side of this, which I think fuels a lot of these things too, which is this whole idea that individual voters and blocks of voters, Steve, can be broken down into discrete packets of data sets that will then, when reconstructed, give you the idea of who the perfect person is and exactly how to speak to them. And the one thing that really, confused me, and this is a vestigial Republican, is we have always been about injecting emotion, and oftentimes a negative emotion. I won't deny that, but it's been effective because politics is an emotional game. But I feel like too many times, and you referenced that Pod Save America interview, which I did a long Substack about, that it was like they were just relying on the machines and they did whatever the machines told them. And again, you're up against people who are politics is inherently irrational, right? We're not selling toothpaste. We're not selling Crest or Colgate. We are selling belief and vision. And it seems to me that they were, candidly, it seems like a giant CYA operation, which is, well, the numbers told us to do this and we won. Yes, listen to the numbers. Or the numbers told us to do this and we lost. Well, the numbers said.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, listen, man, I'm like you. I mean, I think there's both a science and an art to politics, and I believe in the science of it too. But like at some level, you have to, I mean, I remember having this conversation with Mark Putnam, who I think is a genius ad maker and, one of the more creative guys around, about, I don't know, maybe July or August of the off year. I was actually sitting in a parking lot. My wife was waiting me to come in to meet her for lunch, and she's texting me like, get off the phone.
Right. And listen, if you have not had that exchange with your wife, you have not done this job, really.
Yeah. I was late to a wedding anniversary dinner because I got a call from Joe Biden, and it was only this was before he ran. It was the only excuse I possibly could have used. But no, so I'm like, we're having this conversation about immigration. And my thing, like we had done a bunch of research on immigration and found that there were threads that Joe Biden could talk about or Kamala Harris could talk about that at least muddled the issue a little bit. But whether it was, like Republicans would mock this idea they were stopping fentanyl. When we told voters, hey, Joe Biden stopped a record amount of fentanyl, they're like, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Well, that's a good thing. We should be for that. And and I remember Mark and I, like, Mark, I think, was helping Future Forward. I said, listen, man, like I can't afford to do it, but it would be great to see a bunch of ads on immigration. And he's like, I don't disagree. The problem is like, they don't test well. Well, I know they don't fucking test well. But if we don't do anything, then we know what the outcome's going to be. Just trying to bunch of stuff to muddle the conversation. So, because if it becomes about that, we're going to lose. And that was frustrating. I agree. We should talk about choice. We should make that contrast. We should talk about the economic contrast. Like all those things are right. But we also shouldn't just give up the conversation on crime, for example, when we actually had a good story to tell on it. And that was what, it was just such that, not to just belabor this point, but like when you hear why they did not put an ad out on the trans, it's just maddening that they couldn't find one that tested well enough. I mean, to me, like all you had to do is put an ad up saying Donald Trump did the same thing, and by the way, he did more of them. And so what? The issue goes into the gray space now. Voters are like, I don't know what to think now, but that's fine because they don't. At least it's not about that anymore.
Well, but to your point, there were practical examples of people who did that, which were Democratic Senate candidates, like in Wisconsin, like in Michigan, right, who went straight to camera and said it's all BS, right? And then you had what's his name in Pennsylvania who ran like a scalded dog away from it and ends up losing, right? If you talk to voters and say this is the deal, they will listen. If you say nothing, you allow them to assume. And that's one thing, Steve, is like, oh, well, these voters, they did like if the voters didn't vote our way or they were so disgusted they stayed home, like that's on us as professionals, but also as a political system, right? Like if all the things being equal were equal and they chose this guy, is it his fault? Is it the voters' fault? Or is it our fault because we couldn't tell them anything that they wanted to hear more?
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think we probably are cut from a very similar cloth. But I go back. You mentioned my days at what we called House Victory when I ran the House Democratic Caucus in Florida, and the year that we won. So we won 7 seats on election night, then won 2 specials followed. Within those 7 races, I had a guy who ran to the right, a Cuban Democrat who ran to the right of their Cuban opponent on Castro. I had a lady who got the NRA endorsement and ran to the right of her opponent on immigration. I had another guy that ran to ban assault weapons. Like, to me, what was most important was that the candidate was where the median voter was. Like, I was agnostic to what it looked like. I was completely comfortable with any of that as long as that's where the median voter was and we could win those races. And to me, like, where I get frustrated about this entire conversation, like, I barely graduated college, and
Amen. State schools, woo!
I don't want to. I've never put my GPA in anything because
it's not. Nobody needs to know that about me. Right.
But like in the end, I know one thing, which is politics. It's a math question, and if you divide 100 by 2 and add 1, it's 50% plus 1. And if the man or woman at 50% isn't with your candidate, you're going to lose. And so I just feel like we get into this thing where you try to you try to put the mosaic together with this group and that group, but in the end, like you see this. George Bush was this way. Barack Obama was this way. Bill Clinton. If you're talking effectively to that independent or median voter, you know what? Your base usually loves it. But it's, and that's the model. It's not that complicated.
So let me hit the pause button on today and go back to yesterday, especially in a place like Florida. And I know you're not an Ohio guy, but I want to add Ohio because it had a similar transformation, which is these were 2 states that were considered the bellwethers of certainly presidential politics, right? If you won Ohio, you won Florida, you were going to win the presidency. And they both tip, and then just collapsed. Just the bottom collapsed out underneath them. As far as Democrats being able to win statewide, what happened? I mean, how was it? Was it nothing happens, then nothing happens, then nothing happens, then everything happened? Was it something you could see coming? What your expertise is a Florida guy? Tell me how that happened.
It's actually interesting. In fact, if any donors are listening and want to fund this, I would love it. I've actually talked to my old buddy Greg Schultz, who was the Obama state director in 2012 in Ohio, and then ran the Biden campaign through the primary in 2019 and early 2020. I would love to do a poll of Iowa, Ohio, and Florida. 3 states that Obama won twice, 3 states that were very much central to his electoral path to victory, all 3 states which were not competitive at all in 2024. And I'd love to, I have theories on what the through lines are. But I think, if I think a couple of things have happened nationally that have really impacted Florida and probably Ohio. So first of all, in Florida, the fastest growing part of our population are Hispanics. And we have lost between Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Kamala Harris in 2024. So in just 8 years, we've lost 25% of support from 60. I think she won 68%, 67% of the Hispanic vote in 2016 to 42-43 this last cycle. I mean, that right there is 4, 5, 6 points of vote margin right off the top. So you take that piece. Florida has always had a more complicated Black population, in that about a quarter of our Black population is Caribbean, as you know, and so that population has never been as monolithic as it is, say, in New York or whatever. and then the non-college white piece, and that, which is Florida among the battleground states, and Ohio was very similar to this, and so was Iowa, among the white population, much more non-college than college, and so compared to say like a Wisconsin, which has a higher college attainment than we did, and so like those three things were always, always a problem, and then you add to it that like frankly, you probably know this from Republican friends, like a lot of my Democratic friends thought Obama won Florida twice, and now we were just destined to be a blue state. And there was there was a walking away from some basic fundamentals in organizing. There was a kind of a pitch to the left a little bit by some activists, which I've heard, and those things combined have really been there. And, I think that if as a party, we can fix some of the Hispanic issues, some of the non-college white issues, like Florida will get competitive very quickly again. But it's maddening, man. I mean, I've written about it, as you know. It's just watching real time. I just kind of wanted to run into brick walls.
Right. So I had this thought experiment that I came up with based on no research or quantifiable or even qualifiable data, Steve, about Florida in particular. And I said, imagine 3 guys working on a road crew on the I-4 corridor, Orlando, and it's August, and it's 8 million degrees. And there's a black guy, and there's a white guy, and there's a Latino guy. And they're all out there, and it's a traffic jam. And there's a white rich woman in a white Range Rover with a white dog sitting in her car, right, waiting. These guys don't live in the same neighborhoods. They're probably, they're friendly at work, right? Probably don't live near each other. They probably may or may not hang out. Their kids don't go to school together. But when she's sitting there, their thought is, we're out here and she's in there, and we're never going to get in there. And that's always been a part of it, which I think that frankly, the Democratic Party really let go was they after you threw Bernie out, or, not you, but after Bernie's worldview got tossed out in 2015 and 2016, and then again in 2020, economic populism, which was a bulwark and a standard of big D Democratic politics, just went out the window. And so to your point, I think if you're a non-educated white guy, like, it's not only that maybe they pitched left on social issues. I don't think these people like me. If you're a black guy, right, it could be that all of the cynical things we said to black voters over the years, Steve, as Republicans, which is they're taking you for granted, maybe finally caught up. And to your point, if you're a Latino guy, and here's the thing, talk about not monolithic, you could probably tell me how many different ethnicities of Latino voters there are in Florida, but if it's not 10, it might be more, but it's close, right? And that's how I always saw Florida, which is once you couldn't convince those guys that either A, you wanted them, or B, any of it was worth it, it always seemed to me that it was an uphill climb.
Well, I think the one thing that and again, I mean, Obama was sort of my great moment, so I probably
of course
more than I should. But like, he understood implicitly that like in a lot of communities, there's a basic permission structure. So first of all, why do people move to Florida? They move to Florida because the weather's nice and it has low taxes. I mean, I was like, that's kind of for most people, kind of where it starts. And so he ran more ads in Florida on cutting middle class taxes than any issue in both elections. We just knew, for example, that if we could keep the question in polls, who's better for you on taxes, it basically a push between us and McCain or Romney. Like we could go win on other issues, but if we got that out of control, we couldn't. He would go into Cuban communities and talk about that. Yeah, we should open up trade in Latin America. We should let people go back and forth. Let people send money to their families. But oh, by the way, Fidel Castro is a son of a bitch, and he's a dictator. And like he said those things, he pushed back on the socialism stuff in a real hard way. He went into African American and Caribbean communities and had hard conversations, but also talked about economic prosperity. And I think that that mattered. And I think we get away from that in a lot of ways. I mean, it's I remember being in a race a few years back, but it was down sort of in that Sarasota, St. Pete area. And the pollster was like, yeah, I want to know how voters how do voters think on the question of, who stands up for our values or who's more like me or whatever. I'm like, no, I want to know if they think we're going to raise their taxes. That's what I want to know, because like that 68-year-old retiree living on fixed income, insurance rates are going up. That's the one thing they know government can do. And if we lose them there, they're not going to care about anything else we do. And I just, I think it's part of it's that. And I think, to your point too, the economic populism stuff is that, but we've let ourselves get defined in all these other things too. And that's a huge problem.
So let's talk about the Florida of today, the Florida of Ron DeSantis and I assume it's a Republican supermajority. If it's not, it's got to
Yeah.
be close.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was just down in I was down in Florida twice in the past couple of weeks, and one thing was interesting is that Ron DeSantis is now running. Like we have to have our own Doge here in Florida. Like they've been running the state for like 16 years. So if there's inefficiency or waste and fraud, and it's all on you, right? Like, what are you talking about?
26 of my 28 years, Republicans have been in charge. Yeah, it's interesting, and I think what they're it's interesting on their Doge stuff, and this is where, again, I've always been a little. I've been a moderate my whole life. As I joked on Twitter earlier, this week that I was for free trade when most Democrats weren't for free trade, and I am one that believes that local government's the best government you can have. The farther you get away from it, the more troubling. But the Doge thing is really kind of a focus on even local governments and on down. But but again, even in our local governments, I think probably 60 of our 67 counties have majority Republican county commissions. So we'll see where that goes.
But I mean, how is this? I mean, so a couple of things that are being affected right now. America's, you can make, and I have made this argument that quote unquote America's place in the world might not matter to an individual voter in, say, northern Wisconsin, but in Florida, it does matter because if people don't want to come here from elsewhere, if they don't want to go to Disney, if they don't want to go to all the beaches and the Gulf of America or Mexico or whatever, right? I mean, if they don't want to go to 30A. Like those are real dollars out of real people's pockets.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, what's interesting about Florida, it is, if you take all 50 states, the only state that has a larger share of its population, which is migrated into it, is Nevada. And Nevada is about 80% of its population was not born in Nevada. In Florida, we're almost 2/3, almost, I think it's 65% of our population, maybe 66, was born elsewhere. Nearly a quarter of our population wasn't even born in the U.S. We have, anywhere between 135, 140 million tourists a year that come here. I think it's like 74 million people fly in and out of the Orlando airport every year. So our economy is frankly entirely based on movement. I mean, we don't have, we are not a place, despite the fact that I think folks have tried, we're not a place that have a lot of Fortune 500, headquarters. We don't, Miami, I think, is getting more economically focused towards Latin America, but it is not. It's funny, back when Charlie Crist ran for governor, had he won, I wanted to go into his administration for one goal. I wanted to work on what it took to make Miami the equivalent to, say, Hong Kong or Singapore in Asia or London in Europe. To me, Miami should be the undisputed capital of Latin America. But that requires being, externally focused. And you're right. The minute that people stop coming here and we see this, and what's interesting, so economically, when Florida has higher highs and lower lows economically. So when the economy is doing well in the country and people are moving, our economy is just gangbusters. But, as we saw, say, during the Great Recession from 08 to 10, we had unemployment as high as 12 and 13% in Florida. Because again, once people stop coming here, people stop building homes, people stop building new buildings downtown, that our entire economy in Florida is based on that churn.
So let me ask. I want to ask one more question about the Florida economics, which is because you've had so many hurricanes hit recently. We had most recently Helene. I know, and I know that I've experienced this in the mountains of Utah, where Steve, they now say fire danger is a real thing. I mean, we've had fires, but nothing where it's like in my neighborhood. California, Louisiana, Florida, right? It's very difficult to get your home insured. The state is sort of the insurer of last resort. But how do you do to your point about people, if you want to move to Florida and you're not someone who's going to buy a house in Sarasota in cash, how do you do that? Or is it just going to become a renter society?
I think it's a real challenge. My property insurance rates in the last 6 years have probably gone up 350%. And now, fortunately, I live 45 miles from the ocean. My number is still modest compared to, somebody that lives on the boat on the beach. But it's you feel it. I mean, it's real. And, I think that there's, again, the thing that Florida was for people, it was that thing when you lived in Cincinnati your whole life, there's that dream of saving up, saving a nest egg, moving to Florida, buying a little patio home on a golf course for a couple $100,000. And Florida was seen as this place that had a low to medium cost of living and great weather.
Right. And other people from the Midwest, the upper Midwest, you'd all been snowbirds together and you all finally made the move.
Yeah, exactly. It was the thing you
Yeah.
dreamed about your whole life. And it's funny about our politics. I remember Bob Graham, former Governor Graham, who, God bless his soul, we've been gone about a year now. He used to say about Florida, like the problem with Florida politics is like that family from Cincinnati, like they still viewed their entire political world through the Cincinnati lens, and like you had to deal with that as a politician. But yeah, I mean, it's there's even in Tallahassee, which is a lower cost of living part of why I love living here compared to the rest of the state. The starter home on the road, kind of out to where I live, is like $400,000. I don't, and I think that's as we look, 10, 12 years down the road, can that retired nurse or postal worker, is that dream achievable? And I don't know. And again, if it's not, then I don't know economically what we look like, but it's an absolute public policy challenge we have going forward.
So I want to stay on the theme of movement for a second. So you wrote a piece about this, I think maybe a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago. I started talking about it last summer when I first saw a map that the Brennan Center for Justice had developed, which was that in the 2030 census, places like California and New York could lose as many as 4 congressional seats each. And places like Texas and Florida will pick up as many as 4 congressional districts and electoral votes each. So that's a 16-seat swing from the west and the north to the southeast. And then, Oregon's going to lose one. Utah, where I live, picks one up. Idaho picks one up. Maybe Wisconsin. But the point is like there's this massive movement basically into the old Confederacy, because you got also Tennessee and Georgia and the Carolinas. Give us a little sense of what you wrote about and how we who are the non-MAGA contingent can and should be preparing for that. Because, and let me just say this, is that if you are not a fan of Donald Trump, if you're not a fan of what's going on, in 2032, theoretically, Steve, the blue wall in the upper Midwest could get you to 260.
Yeah, it's actually even scarier than that. I mean, it's even worse than that right now. The last projection I saw, so, for the not people that don't live this stuff for people who have actual lives, let's put it that way. The basic path to victory if you're a Democrat is you win sort of the Clinton states, New Hampshire's, et cetera. That gets you to like 228 or something, and then you add Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then you add that one congressional seat in Nebraska, and that gets you to exactly 270. And so, and God help if we ever have 269, or Congress ever picks a president, we may be done. But, just on the projections today, that 270 number goes to 257. So to win the White House, and, you win in Nevada or in Arizona, or you have to win in North Carolina, or you have to win in Georgia, or you have to figure out how to make a Florida better, or you've got to figure out some other mix. Is there a way to bring a Mississippi online? Can a Kansas become, which we've elected governors, become more? The point is, like, we have to win in places we've been losing. And, I think that part of my frustration, and, Reed, like the entire focus of political parties is about electing a president. I mean, the reason why we have them is about electing a president. And we live in this cycle of how do you get to 270 in every 4 years? But for the first time, as long as I've been in politics, like, we have to think about how we're going to do things differently. And so for me, part of what we want to do at Unite the Country, assuming we kind of keep doing this for a while, is really start digging into these places that again, either are places that we used to win fairly recently and are now losing, Nevada being the most obvious one,
right?
But also places like Florida, or places where we've had some success, Georgia, or places like North Carolina that look interesting. And there are other places like, as a Southern guy, I've always been intrigued by Mississippi, which has this huge Black population. Is there a way, as college attainment becomes more of a thing, that maybe there's a way to win there over time? Or, obviously there's the Texas thing, but we've also have to protect some stuff that we've got. And I think we have some group of people have to be focused on playing in races, doing some comms, doing some organizing in these places, because if not, we're going to wake up in 2032 and we're going to have a map where we got to go change voters' mindsets in ways that is going to be very hard. But I think it's a real concern. I was actually really happy to see Ken Martin when he came to Florida during the special elections recently, talk about this as one of the reasons why they have to be here. And the other thing that not to belabor this, but, I say to donors about my state, and I would say it about Texas as well. Even if you don't believe that my state or Texas is winnable at a statewide level in the near future, and that may be right. I don't know. I have to not think that because I have to live here. I have to get up out of bed every morning, but that may be true. If you want to win majorities in Congress, we have to win more seats in places like Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, and we have to win them in states where we're getting gerrymandered. I mean, these are just realities, and so it becomes a basic survival. I mean, the right now we've got a nice path to get to a majority in 2 years, and I think we'll take back the House in 2 years. But if we were operating under the 2032 map right now, I don't know if we can get the House back in this 2-year cycle, because we'd have to go win in these places where we're really struggling. I just think we need to. I don't have all the solutions to it. But I don't think we can stop talking about it enough.
Well, and I would say this, and this is what we're doing at the union too, and I hope that we will collaborate more as the year goes on. Is it in where you? It's not only that you have to win races where you haven't lived, you have to win them down ballot, because in some places, right, if you can just break a supermajority in a state legislature, right, then maybe you eke out an extra seat or two because the Republicans desperately need you to bend, they need to break you. And you're like, I'm not doing anything until I get, I make sure that these 2 seats are saved or whatever. And look, that's the sausage making of politics, but it is what it is. The other part too, and I was talking to Joe Trippi, and I were just in Sarasota a little while ago, and we were talking before we spoke to this group of, sort of, upper income disaffected voters, right? They're all moderates. They're sort of the no labels type voters, Steve. And there's this stat: 71% of Republicans ran unopposed in 2024. But we're thinking about it wrong. That means that Democrats only competed in 29% of available races. That's not sustainable. That makes you a rump party. That makes you a regional party at best. And to me, to your point, that's like why, again, I'm an independent, proud independent. Our organization is nonpartisan. But for me, the health of the republic is desperate for competition. And if you're not going to have it, as I've said before, and the listeners are probably sick of me saying, like, we're on the beach here, gang, right? Like, and if we don't start throwing people into races, and I know you and I have a slightly different version of what that means, right? If we don't start putting people up, then it's not going to matter. To your point, we're going to get to 2032. The Democrat, at best, it gets to 259 or 257, whatever it is. And the rest of it just collapses underneath itself because there's no there. And even being one of 2 parties where all the voters are fickle and both parties are unpopular doesn't become enough, because, as you said, the Republicans are really, really good at using the power of democracy to overturn democracy.
Yeah. And, and again, I would, I've had this little idea for years, and I never had time to go really work on it, but I always wanted to build kind of a little, almost like Emily's List kind of thing for candidates in Florida to run for like city commissions and county commissions and school boards in places that we needed to do better in. I mean, because part of the challenge in my view, like, listen, I totally agree, we need to compete in more places, but like in a lot of these places, we also need to compete with better candidates. And, the reality is, like you and I both know, if you take, a well-intentioned suburban mom or PTA dad, and you put them in a congressional race in Mississippi, and they don't know how to run a campaign, we all know what's going to happen there. And I don't know if we get anything good or bad out of that. But if we can, in some of these communities, like, it'd be really cool to do, like, is there like a Marshall Plan in these like lean red states we have to do better in, just to go like try to elect a ton of people down the ballot, so that when we get to that conversation in a couple of years, we have people that have their own political currency that can run for Congress in tougher places, or run for the state legislature, or run for down ballot statewide races. Because it's not just a function of like we don't have candidates in a lot of places. Like we have no credible farm team either.
Right.
And I mean, take the special election in Northeast Florida recently. I don't know that a Democrat ever could have won there at all. And this is no disrespect to the guy that ran and the campaign they tried to put together, but like, we had both the Republican and the Democrat. Neither one of them lived in the district they ran in. If we had like a state legislator or a county commissioner or a mayor of one of the cities there, like you might have given Randy Fine a real run for his money, rather than just kind of us having generic Democrat versus, kind of maybe weaker Republican opponent. And again, that's like, and this, I mean, I know this from my days running state house races on a more real way. Like when you're running uphill, you have to have the better candidate. You can't have the weaker candidate and be in a bad electoral position. Like you have to have the better candidate, and that work takes time.
Yeah, it does. Well, and that's the one thing that as I have gone around the country and gone to different places just at the beginning of this year, Steve, that I've seen is we have I use this word intentionally because I think it's true. We have this real tension between a donor and a consultant class who believe federal races are the only thing that matters and that 2026 is the only thing that matters at the federal level. Okay, like I'm not saying it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is you're not going to get the result you want until and unless you realize like the work that has to happen now is not whiz bang, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not algorithms. It's like, how do we get people, like if we want to compete in these races, we have to start now by figuring out who the hell are we going to get to compete in these races? Who are we going to put up now for school board, right, in 25 so that they could run for state leg in 26 or 28 or whatever it is. And that's, to me, the real thing that I've seen is that everybody's like, but what's the slogan now? What's the bumper sticker? What are our hats going to say? And I'm like, but like you see, like what you guys want to do, it doesn't just magically happen. There's work involved. And I think that's one thing, the people on the right, like they, this expression came up twice in this last thing I did, right? They're like the Alabama football team. They just reload. Right? Every time they just reload, they just put more money in, they put more resources in, they create new organizations, they do all this stuff because for them, ironically enough, it's like, yeah, we're willing to lose here and there if we gather up so much market share in so many places and we're occupying so much mind space and so much literal territory that there's no way they can come back. Ultimately, we're going to win, right? Like we're going to be on top. And you could make an argument. They've been at it for 40 or 50 years, Steve, and it was a good strategy.
100%. One of my more interesting guys, and if you ever want an interesting sort of a different perspective guest, one of my favorite people in the world is a guy named Zeb Smathers. Absolutely great name. Zeb is the mayor of this little town near where I have a house in North Carolina called Canton. And Canton's this old blue collar paper mill town. It was absolutely wrecked by the hurricane, unfortunately. Really thoughtful, creative guy who's also a Southern Democrat, who's managed to win a mayor's race and being a very effective mayor in this just, type of place that if you drove through, you just could kind of assume there was a MAGA kind of guy who was mayor. And, what I would love to figure out a way, how do we find 100 guys like Zeb, who are not only like, are they necessarily Democrats or moderates, however you're going to put it, but like are also, I think this is a problem we saw in the Biden administration. Like Zeb's getting shit done in his city. And, it's not just a function of being right ideological or whatever. A lot of times, like we don't do that part of it really well. And again, I think that, when you think about how we win in places like North Carolina long term or Georgia, it's going to be driven by guys like that. Not like guys like me pontificating about numbers from an office in Florida. And I think and I'd love to see donors say, all right, let's how do we lean into that? How do we spend $20 million in the next 2 or 3 years finding 25 more guys like that who one day could run for Congress or could run for governor or could run for, some other office in their state, where we're not necessarily winning as much as we should.
And they're not likely going to be the people that you would want them to be. They're going to be who they are, doing the things, as you said, in the communities that need to get done. Look, I'm friendly with several mayors, some from big towns, some from smaller towns. Like when you're mayor, like you can have whatever vision you want, but like if the trash isn't getting picked up, if people are getting harassed on the street, if where I live, the snow doesn't get plowed, like the rest of it doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't matter because if your whole job is to make sure that the daily functions of life become an afterthought for your citizens, not something they have to worry about, then whatever grander vision you might have for what you want to do isn't going to happen because people are like, why should I trust you with that when like the water doesn't work, right? Like the electricity keeps failing. And I think it's a legitimate thing, which is most Americans are like, look, I just want to get on with my life. I don't want to have to worry about this stuff. And you are making me worry about it.
Exactly. And those are the kind of people that when they run for offices that may be in a a lean Republican area, or you see Republicans running in lean Democratic areas, they've got a different conversation they can have with voters. And, that's where, like, I mean, again, for me, we think about this 2030, this 2030 problem, which, God, I can't even hard to get the words 2030 out of my mouth. When did I get that old? But that's where it starts. And again, I go back to, again, not to belabor this point, but when I ran our House caucus back in the day with one of these seats, like, I elected, I think, 3 mayors in lean Republican communities to the state legislature. People who then got reelected because they had that currency with voters that was different than just a guy that had a party label. And I love mayors, I love city commissioners, I love school board members. Like, these people, and again, but we have to start getting them elected, so that we can eventually hopefully run them for higher office.
Right. And also, if you're willing to, those are thankless jobs too, right? Everybody, even if you're good at your job, somebody's unhappy, right? It's that sort of 10%, 25% rule. It doesn't matter what anybody says, right? If you say the sky is blue, some 25% of assholes are going to say it's purple, right?
I'm sure you probably thought about it too. I mean, I think it's part of being a hack. I thought about running for city council one time, and my wife was like, "Hey, we're already really busy. Like, do you really want us to not be able to go to the grocery store?" And one of my favorite state legislators here is a woman named Christine Onchowski, who's mayor of Parkland, or unfortunately she was mayor of Parkland when the tragedy happened. But she talks about, like, she literally can't go to a park, she can't go to a grocery store or gas station without somebody asking her about something. But then again, that's also the sign of a good leader, somebody who voters have that much confidence in.
But you make a good point, and then I'm going to let you go here, which is, if she is mayor or was mayor of Parkland and is now a state legislator, this idea that voters or citizens don't know what's going on and don't know who represents them. Yes, there is always going to be somebody who's like, I don't care, it doesn't matter. But if you are that person, if you're that woman, that representative, and you're going to the park and someone recognizes you, something's filtering down, right? Like, it is filtering down. And that's the one thing I saw, you've probably seen too. Most of the people I ran into weren't traditional consumers of news, Steve, but that didn't make them uninformed. They very much knew what their options were. And they're like, nah, whatever. All right, Steve, before I let you go, where can we find you online? Where can we find your Substack? Where else can we find stuff about you?
Yeah, so I'm kind of I don't do this super well. I'm online a lot of places. I'm probably on Twitter, X, whatever, more than anything. I've never made fully migrated off. So I'm just at Steve Schale, I think, on Twitter and on Blue Sky. I'm on Twitter more than I am on Blue Sky. You also have to put up with my bad Jacksonville Jaguars puns. Being both a Florida Democrat and a Jacksonville Jaguars fan, it's a difficult life.
Jesus, you're really a glutton for punishment.
Oh my God, it's so. I know, like, and both times they're like little windows that were really good.
Yeah.
But like, a lot of it's just not great. I do have a Substack. I think it's Man of Florida, because they wouldn't let me do Florida Man. And then I also have a website, steveschale.com, which basically I just put stuff I put on Substack on that too. But yeah, appreciate having me on, Reed. It's been fun, and I've enjoyed us, texting and collaborating on some stuff, and I appreciate the voice you bring to this too.
No, absolutely. And as always, guys, you can find me on Twitter, at TikTok, at says.us, SEZ.USA, and Blue Sky at Reed Galen, Instagram and Threads at Reed_Galen USA, and also Substack, The Homefront. Please subscribe to Steve and my Substack. Steve Schale, thanks for joining me.
Thanks again, Reed. Really enjoyed it.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.